Like an authentic hell, all the best knights, including carrion, risking all their own power and over the boundless expanses of the contaminated land, only death remained. A young man is still struggling to pull a big hammer. In front of him, a huge creature was seen that towered up to the very mountain. Creature was already badly injured and, including one of his arms, was missing, but he was still able to stand up and play a trick on the small person in front of him with all the power he had left. The young man gathered mana from within his own body in order to raise a big hammer with all his might. A young man tried to attack monster but was thrown back by the remaining hand of the monster. But the young man still did not want to appear. He continued to strain his own inner strength until one of the monster's arms broke, and in the end, it didn't take a long time for the monster to explode. A corpse that was broken into pieces, but in the end it was the only one who survived. A young man named Tiny finally smiled with relief due to the fact that he had actually won the victory of the strongest monster on the borders of perdition. The Tiny One remembered the past that he was passed through a unique training, is considered a knight. He has also overcome all sorts of obstacles to progress and to rise to the top of feeling from the lowest position. This young man always believed that he could overcome all kinds of problems, but after all, look at him at the moment. He not only failed to rescue others, but also helplessly watched the entire mainland crumbling before his eyes. The Tiny One had the opportunity only for a moment to relieve himself after defeating the demon commander of gluttony, due to the fact that he was only 7 of all the demon commanders. Above him was the Lord of Demons, who knew how terrible this figure was. When he suddenly fell down, someone called the neat old man got up with his last strength. He was the Blades of Asgard, the ruler of the field of Valentine, one of the most beautiful knights. The Tiny One knew, in fact, that the dilapidated knight was glad to see Tiny in security, but he was already on the borders of death before the knight of the field of Valentine left. He asked the Tiny question, "How is it? Why would you cannot escape from this battle?" Due to the fact that, according to the texts of the Knight Field of Valentine, the young man who came from the slums had some to defend. In the end, with a languid heart, the Tiny One declared on what basis he withstood until the end of the battle. But he, a peasant who is full of conviction wherever he is, due to the fact that he does not want to rush in order to receive the commitment of God. The old recorder was happily laughed at by Tiny's answer until, in the end, his smile did not subside and told the Tiny One to find him afterwards. As he returned, the Tiny One, who was confused, asked the question, in fact, what did the decrepit knight look like? After that night, Paula Valentine discovered once a significant secret of his life. She gave the name of her own daughter at birth and rubbed the purple ring on her left index finger. Due to the deeds of the Knight Field Valentina, the unfamiliar light of mana was seen all around the Tiny One, slowly disappearing into understanding. When the Tiny One slowly opened his eyes, he noticed the corpse of his own elder sister, weakly lying on his bed. The Tiny One understood, in fact, what it was not the best time in his life. A small Tiny noticed how his older sister, the corpse, is taken away by 2 bandits for realization. The Tiny One at that time could only look and follow the torso of his own sister. When the Tiny One tried to move his painful corpse, in the end, the Tiny One really had the opportunity to arrange it. He immediately rushed into his similar corpse, defends it from beating the bandit afterwards, such as they got tired of beating the Tiny One. They simply left when they went one-on-one with the torso of their own older sister. The Tiny One realized that his corpse now has the ability to apply mana, including at this age he is not obliged to be able to use mana. The Tiny One finally remembered Vaughn Valentina's nightly news. Now the Tiny One understood that it was actually Knight Vaughn Valentine had in mind, asking him to meet him as soon as he returned. The Wii was banished to the past. The Wii was not very happy to be returned at the time when his corpse was at its weakest, but he intended to use this probability in order to grant his older sister's virtuous funeral. Is that in fact he did not have the opportunity to arrange in his own past life. The Tiny wiped the tears from his face and promised to take revenge on the wolf, the figure that killed his older sister, and 2 correct bodyguards for the coming day. The boy gave his elder sister a virtuous funeral. The sister lay in a coffin with bouquets of flowers around her, but the Tiny One did not have the opportunity to repay the arena until she died. At least for this one, Tiny One was able to give his older sister a virtuous funeral. Best friend of Emma, Arena, who was at her funeral. What a day. I realized that, in fact, the Tiny One checked a rather unusual change, which the boy had the opportunity to eat rather greedily, including in front of the corpse of his older sister, including his wounds disappeared. but he was, for example, beaten hard almost yesterday after such how this tiny one, including here, grabbed the corpse of her own older sister with her hands, categorically refused them as support and simply arrested her sister, thanking her, and the baby still reproached herself for not being able to defend her own older sister. However, he remembered that Manage actually begged him to continue to be convinced and not seem from this stage. Baby will begin to create, as his older sister said. The moon through baby sets off to the wolf base to find courageously revenge. The boy challenged the guards standing in front of the gate. They did not allow the kid to enter and almost immediately beat him, but the tiny now reacted quite well. With ease, the tiny one has the ability to break the enemy's hand and kick him. The enemy hovering in the distance, the tiny one has the ability to immediately beat up two mature ones. Due to the fact that her mana returned, the tiny one used the autonomously created secret technique. It was a technique that had the ability to combine a corpse composed of mana and a corporeal corpse together. The tiny one seemed to like to beat two mature men in front of him. He also thanked two bandits who tested his tenacity with his tiny hand threw back the first bandit with similar power, in fact that he went into the keyhole of the wolf base. A mature man immediately attacks a tiny one as soon as the boy enters, but, unfortunately, they all end up thrown away. In fact, in almost a matter of seconds, an enemy fell who numbered 10 people. Only 2 red-haired men were preserved there. They stand on the balcony. Tiny confidently invited 2 mature men to go down and fight him. A small Tiny challenged 2 bandits standing on the 2nd floor, since he pulled out a blade from them right there and wanted to be Tiny until he noticed that this little boy had mana in his body. They were both even happier, having seen this precedent. In fact, that such a small boy already had powerful mana. While 2 of her enemies had already jumped down, the tiny one was still preoccupied with the bodies of the people she had used as weapons. His intellect returned to the past when his companion found him using someone's corpse as a weapon. His partner God also gave him advice to use a bad trick, which was quite massive, but just a hand-to-hand battle or an elementary battle with bare hands. The tiny one prefers to use this method due to the fact that he actually has the ability to support his pride. As soon as 2 enemies jumped up and stormed him, Tiny, the boy got away from the attacks. After that he punched one of his own enemies with his fist, quickly orienting him to the person, sending him into the air, literally, for example, like Tinny arranged with another young person, while the bodies of 2 enemies were still in the air. Bright moonlight Tiny threw the weak corpse of the enemy to the balcony where the wolf stood alone. A man with a muscular build and brown hair somehow asked a question. Tiny given figure the wolf's presence forced the tiny one to recall the past when they themselves collided with another in the past. The tiny one was rather extremely surprised when she found out that, in fact, the wolf, who is considered a pimp in a remote area, apparently belonged to the tribe of Beastmen, which is the best tribe between mixed races, and between them, a pure silver werewolf is special due to the fact that he has a lineage that usually appears in a direct pedigree. In the past life of the royal family, it was not easy for the tin can to destroy this figure in front of it this time, not paying attention to the fact that the tinny is determined to once again quickly win the victory of the wolf. The wolf asked the boy's question. You arranged it with a sarcastic smirk. The tiny one answered, actually that it was what the wolf wanted. The tiny table of contents of the text enraged the big man. He immediately reincarnated into a personal flagship. The demon will form. His figure became more and more filled with muscles, and he had a debt, including a similar tiny one. Not startled, the boy was extremely surprised, contemplating, in fact, the paint of the furs of the wolf, which was supposed to be silver, has now become only brownish due to the fact that the boy provoked the wolf's anger at him. They attacked him at great speed here. The tiny one continued to dodge, analyzing the power of the enemy's attack. The boy was somewhat disappointed that the wolf in this life could not be compared with how he was in the past life of the baby. The power of the wolf in this life. The tiny one caught the big wolf's face and quickly charged it with great power of mana, causing the wolf to yell in pain and reflexively retreat from the tidy, while the boy smiled carelessly due to the fact that his attack immediately had a sick effect. The tiny one remembered the news wolf from him previous life in case he wanted to win the victory of his own family members who were furious. The tiny one would simply have to give him a certain number of blows. This is what the tiny boy is actually preparing at the beginning. The boy still blindly avoided the attacks of the furious wolves, but subsequently such as he found the smallest gap. Here he firmly punched the wolf in the face until the demon fell down and weakened. When the monster was practically defeated, the tiny one asked him not to die first due to the fact that he actually wanted to beat him to death. The tiny one also gave the monster kicks the series, and at the end the boy punches a penalty, from which a huge wolf flies away, for example, far away, which actually hits. The wolf demon no longer had the opportunity to wake up. He, among other things, quickly returned to his own human form. The tiny one approached him and asked him to come to his senses. As soon as he woke up, the wolf desperately asked the question of why the tiny one arranged this with him. During this time, the tiny one immediately barked at the mature person in front of him and asked the wolf to apologize to his sister before this tiny one again hits the corpse of the human wolf. Before he faded, understanding his whole corpse was covered with bruises, tiny dangers. In fact, what if something bad will happen to him again? He will immediately remove the head of the wolf. More adult man immediately understood by his super. Hearing the text of the kid, he bluntly apologized to the deceased arena. In a trembling voice he continued to repeat, "Sorry." When he knelt before the tiny one, it was clear that the wolf was quite horrified by the little boy in front of him. He continued to grumble the text of apologies in front of the arena for all his own mistakes in the past. The tiny one again threatens the wolf, removing his head and taking him to the grave of his own brother. But because the manage probably won't like it, she discouraged this plan so tiny, in fact, that she tried to ask the question, what exactly was the bestial wolf doing in this space like this? When she turned to the side, the tiny one found a scarlet granite, which dropped from the wolf's mouth. When this remembering hand held the granite, a black aura immediately emanated from it. The tiny one understood that it was actually the aura of the demonic Kai. In a second, a figure of a silver werewolf was seen, still caught in a trap, a huge string in the mountain. A huge wolf looked at the tiny angry eyes, while the wolf attacked the neat ones, or instead of this he will be a reinforcement for the tiny one. The leader comes from Tiny's memoirs about what happened in the past. In fact, that the tiny one took advantage of a walk through the forest of spirits with one of her colleagues from this partner. The tiny one found out that the spiritual being was actually a living creature that appeared after the accumulation of mana in the direction of at least 100 years from traveling with its own tiny partner. Still found out that there were spiritual beings outside of Albenheim due to the fact that all this time he knew that spirit animals were a rarity in his. The companion told the tiny one that in fact the soul of a spiritual being is called a spirit. From this colleague the tiny one also learned about apti. This is granite, which they used to catch the souls of spiritual animals. Now return to the small tiny one, who is still surprised, having seen the granite of the essence in his own hand. The tiny one was taken aback why the werewolf has the opportunity to possess this valuable item, which he was still under unusual life circumstances due to the fact that the spirit of the wolf emitted demonic Kai, which was usually located in the tiny stones of the spirit of the imp. They still moved in order to damage the chains that bound the soul of the silver wolf spirit. As soon as the chain was broken, the werewolf, for example, he roared loudly, in fact, that the tiny one froze with an astonished expression on his face. Slowly, the memoirs of the spirit flooded Tiny's head. It was a memory right before Steph's spiritual beginning. At the beginning, the being was surrounded by an abundance of people in robes, and they all wielded the demonic energy of Kai, the spirit of the beast. For example, he was attacked blindly, in fact, that he quickly fell down when, in the end, the silver wolf was unable to. His heart was pierced to find the granite of the spirit hidden from inside him. During this time people gave a drop of spirit to the boy between them and given stone. The boy immediately reincarnated into a wolf beastman whose tiny one had just actually won a victory from this boy. Apparently those mysterious people made beastmen, forcing people to eat the spirit pebbles. The little one looked hurtfully at the wolf, who was still on his knees and apologizing to his older sister. The little boy was lucky, in fact, that the wolf had not completely absorbed the silver. The spirit energy of the wolf tiny turned. He controlled the spirits of the silver wolves, who wished to destroy the tiny wolves, promptly warned the wolf, due to the fact that, in his opinion, the wolf deserved more sad death in an instant. The tiny one was shocked to understand, in fact, that this church animal, before that, what did he understand? In fact, what he said, including if he did not have the taming of the spirit, he had a fairly pure soul and enough mana, but a kid with a fairly pure soul would also be able to arrange that, Tiny stated. Aston's companion, who was an expert in spirit animals when she was tiny, still wondered why she was able to know the silver wolf. The big creature suddenly shook its head. It touched the face of the kid's head, as if to show that, in fact, they had every chance of knowing, due to the fact that at the very moment when Tiny broke the trap, the boy's mana flowed into the silver wolf. Church granite fills a fixed proportion of the spirit stones and allows them to be known as Tiny during this time. Ask the question, what does this actually mean? In fact, that they have every chance to do it again. The conclusion of the agreement. The silver wolf gave an answer, nodding his head for example. Excitedly, Tinny survive her mother's perfect hand in order to conclude a contract with a silver wolf. The little one remembered the pests in the sketch of Aston. Once from his colleagues he became the best fighter out of 10 famous knights. The girl had enough mana, in fact, that she had a rather powerful and important totemic beast. Ellie Tiny remembered that the spiritual animals were different from magic. As a result of this, while he stuffed himself with the necessary amount of mana in order to exist, he always found supporters. Spiritual beings and the bulk of spirits become stronger as the power of the owner increases. That's where the Tiny now he wanted to conclude an agreement with the silver wolf so that he could help him, but the wolf categorically refused. He wanted the Tiny one to arrange one favor in order to form a contract with him, or rather, the creature wanted the Tiny one to help him take revenge. The little boy smiled during this time. The Tiny one confidently declared, "In fact, it doesn't make much sense to me due to the fact that I actually intended to destroy everyone who is connected with the demonic kite." Having heard that the silver wolf allowed the Tiny one to touch his own torso and concluded an agreement, after which he slowly decreased to the volume of an ordinary dog's. Tiny also started in order to invent an auspicious name for this totem animal. In the end, the Tiny one gave the name to the monthly wolf due to the fact that the wolf has silver fur, which shines brightly like a moon. After such as she completed her own affairs with the silver she-wolf, the Tiny one turned to the wolf who was still bowing and apologizing to Arena. The Tiny one wondered who liked them, however, the man behind the beastman. Seeing that they were actually wearing hoods and wielding Kai's demonic energy, they must be fanatics of devil worshippers. Reject the goddess and worship the devil. Those who threw the universe into disarray before the army of the Imp King was seen as one at that moment when the baby was deep and thought about the devilish cultists. The wolf yelled at one moment. The Tiny one was annoyed and immediately kicked him. For example, as a mature person had not yet come to his senses, the Tiny one turned to the moon wolf for support. "Church animal here," he growled, until the wolf came to an understanding. The Tiny one again asked the question, "Where is the person who gave the granite of the spirit to the wolf with a pale face?" The wolf answered that they were an organization, but at one moment the expression of the wolf changed. He laughed with a terrible grin. A huge man said that the organization would not allow a tiny one to get off the hook. But for example, just like him, you are about to feel the gigantic power that the organization owned. It erupted. The head of the wolf erupted and shattered into fragments right in front of the eyes of the tiny boy. Understood that they actually stuffed Wolf into the eater with explosives, again making the big man unable to reveal the secrets again given Tiny's organization. The boy did not want to worry about events that were, for example, the same as in the past. He noticed a hole in the wall and decided to arrange something more weighty. The smallest also threw the dead body of the wolf to the wall in order to worsen the harm. Because the wall was a giant safe door was seen, the tiny one took the wolf by the hand in order to find a lock protected by mana. After the door opened, the tiny one said that she would actually arrange her own future supporter as a confidant of the ruler of the blade. Serenely and confidently smiling again, the tiny one stepped into the safe filled with treasures. He pulled out a golden ring that would later be used in order to force the ruler of the blade to believe him. The situation continues with a pretty smirk of a girl who finds out how the kid is invited due to the fact that he actually liked the name. The little girl gave him the ring and asked the boy to find him if he needs support at the moment. The tiny one at this stage is again holding the ring, accompanied by his own silver wolf. He remembered a kind girl she was and understood that everyone who lived in the slum was a fresh Chloe Field Valentine. Also she was exclusively the youngest daughter of the ruler of the blade. The girl was popular for her generosity in childhood. Case in Tiny still vividly recalls the conflict when they first met. At that time Chloe was only 16 years old and she laid flowers at the temple as usual in Valentina's family in a past life. It was not easy for the tiny one to return the ring. Now that he pocketed the ring, all that remained was to find a method to approach the blade. The tiny ruler looked out when he heard a low, mature voice. The man is looking for him. This boy smiled and understood that it was time for him to get acquainted with the owner of this voice. Below, an armored fighter was looking around for the offender who had disturbed the base of the wolf. Did not have the opportunity to trust that, in fact, the offender, who could beat all the mature ones, was a small boy. A person important to him tried to attribute that the boy actually used the corpse of another mature man in order to punish his own partner, but instead of this, a fighter was beaten and accused of drug use. For example, that his thoughts were wandering. This bald warriors were inviting a lamb Now he actually wanted to increase the protection fee because of this conflict until, in the end, the tiny one came down the stairs with a laugh on his face. The bandits who delivered the lamb to the space immediately accused the crumb of liquidating their space. The lamb asked if the tinny demolished the space. The tiny one somehow answered, in fact, that this is not the whole personality of the lamb. Hunched over, he got angry when he asked if the tiny one understood about the consequences of such. In fact, what he arranged, another tiny something how. He actually tried that he simply wanted to clean up public trash. Just as smallest didn't understand why the fighter came to do this business without any fear. This boy immediately accused the lamb of actually taking a large number of bribes